Dusk's fog shrouded the mountain trail near the Violet Ridge Gorge. Moisture had soaked inches into the damp earth, and its scent carried for a quarter of a mile. A large wolf crept along the rocks, keeping its massive body low to the ground. He could taste the metallic tang of blood on his tongue, carried by the gusts of wind. The soft howling of the breeze sounded like a warning. The beast took a careful step. His paws squelched in the mud, and his yellow eyes stared intently ahead. This wolf was called Ryko. On the surface, he looked no different from any other forest predator, yet his mind belonged to a werewolf. Once he lived among others of his kind, sharing prey and hunting together. But constant infighting, bloody skirmishes, and a passion for killing humans drove him away from the pack. He did not see himself as humanity's savior, yet he had no desire to live amid endless slaughter. Now Ryko preferred solitude on the slopes of Mount Eisenklippe. From there, he sometimes gazed down at the city of Kirchwalden. They said it was about 5 miles to the main gates of the Duke's castle. Fortified walls and a garrison securely protected those lands from anyone who dared challenge the ruler's will. Kirchwalden went on with its life. People worked, traded, strolled at fairs, and sent messengers to nearby valleys. Still, dark rumors circulated. Superstitious locals spoke of an ancient curse cast by a sorcerer executed long ago. According to legend, if people crossed a certain line of cruelty, a beast would emerge from the forest depths and sweep the city away. Ryko paid it no heed, though he often overheard hushed talk of these prophecies at the market. To him they were just another human scare story. The life of an outcast had its price. Ryko learned to survive alone. He could easily shift into human form and go down to the market. There, he sold hides and meat, keeping to the shadows. At the first sight of a patrol or nosy individuals, he preferred to leave rather than wait for questions. The townsfolk regarded him as a grim hunter with a wolf trophy slung over his shoulder. Sometimes he bought books from traveling merchants, having learned to read in his early youth. Evenings back in his cave, he would light a small fire and lose himself in those books. The wind howled above the cliffs, but it did not frighten him. It was simpler to stay clear of any strife with fellow werewolves than to be drawn into old quarrels again. But tonight, as dusk thickened, Ryko picked up the fresh scent of blood. The trail led to a bend in the road, where deep wheel ruts were carved into the mud. The air reeked of more than just blood. It held the odor of decay. A faint breeze blew the fog toward the gorge, narrowing visibility to only a few yards. Ryko moved forward, tense and prepared for anything. He disliked interfering in human affairs, yet he could not ignore blood this fresh. After a few hundred feet, the werewolf came across an overturned dormeuse carriage. Its wheels were broken, and crates of pastries lay scattered. Several bodies lay in the muck. Judging by their armor, these men had been guards for some important passenger. Ryko grimaced with distaste. Such attacks were usually the work of vicious bandits, or possibly other werewolves, though among the ones he knew, not all were so reckless this close to a fortified duchy. Inside the carriage, he discovered more victims. Their postures showed they had fought to the last. Ryko stepped back, realizing these people would never rise again. He was about to leave, not wanting to leave tracks for patrols that might arrive at any moment. But in the stillness came a thin sound, like a pitiful whimper from a cornered creature. Ryko listened closely. The noise came from beneath the wreckage, Carefully clearing away the wet boards, he found a little girl, about 5 years old. She wore a thin dress, stained with blood and dirt. Tears and terror had swollen her eyes, and her lips trembled. Seeing the huge wolf with blazing yellow eyes, she cried out, but suddenly clutched at his fur, pressing herself against his warm flank. Raiko was dumbfounded. Children usually ran or screamed at the sight of a beast. But this child clung to him, calling him a good wolf. Raiko quickly realized he couldn't leave her there. Any wandering thieves or predators would tear the tiny thing apart. He knew the road into the city was dangerous, and he himself had no plans to go there tonight. The girl was barely able to stand, so the werewolf gently lifted her onto his back. She immediately held fast to his fur, pressing her face against his side. He headed toward the rocky slopes, moving as quickly and smoothly as he could. After about half a mile through the fog, he reached his cave. Once inside, Raiko carefully set the child down on a makeshift bedding. Deep within, he felt something strange. For the first time, a human looked at him not with disgust, but with a mixture of fearful trust and hope. The little girl began dozing right by his paws. He knew he would have to shift forms to start a fire. Through her shivers, she whispered, calling him a big dog. The werewolf's heart felt a pang. Not wanting to betray her trust, he took human form some distance away. Then he added branches to the fire and sat, trying not to make a sound. That night the little girl woke, saw a man in a wolf skin, and asked softly if the kind wizard would run away. Raiko shook his head and handed her a water skin. In that moment he realized he had just taken responsibility for another's fate. The child clinging to his arm was already drifting off again. Raiko felt an unfamiliar calm, as though a faint spark of warmth had touched his solitary existence. The fog thickened outside the cave, but within those walls a fragile peace prevailed. 10 years passed. Morning light barely filtered through the narrow opening of the cave, located about 1.5 miles from the base of Mount Eisenklipp. Once this place had only stored hunting hides and a couple of clay pots, but over time it became a lived-in space. Wooden shelves now lined the walls, holding books, and a burlap curtain split the cave into 2 parts. Behind it was Adela's modest corner, the young woman once found as a child. She had grown tall and slender. Her movements were no longer clumsy but graceful, adapted to life among the crags. She had learned not to fear the gray fogs, the abrupt temperature shifts, or the constant wind. It seemed nature itself had taught her resilience. Raiko rose at dawn to hunt. In his beast form, he tracked prey skillfully, then brought the meat and hides to Kirchwalden to sell at the market. He spent the money on things that made life a bit easier for the girl. Sometimes he bought her hair ribbons or a small piece of sweet pie, though he never quite grasped the point of such luxuries. He only needed to see how Adela's face lit up at the sight of new ribbons or illustrated pages, and that was enough for him. Over time, they forged a close bond. To Adela, Raiko was both rescuer and foster brother, even though she knew he was a werewolf. She no longer startled if she happened upon him in his half-wolf form. He gave her the chance to read books he had purchased. She especially loved tales of castles, princes, and noble ladies, though secretly she regretted never living in a city. When Raiko returned with news from Kirchwalden, she would question him eagerly about the balls, fairs, and customs of the townsfolk. Lately, however, Raiko noticed changes. Adela had become more withdrawn. She often gazed at herself in a crude mirror, trying on ribbons in her hair, then sighing. Sometimes she cried without explanation. He saw that she went to the city less and less. She used to accompany him occasionally, disguised in human clothes beneath a hood. But now she stayed in the cave, as if avoiding people's eyes. Among the rumors spreading from Kirchwalden was word of the old Duke, Gottfried von Steinbrück, having died. His heir, Albrecht, raised in the capital, had taken over. They said he stood out for his handsome looks and his enthusiasm for hunting. All the local ladies were smitten. The Duke was already planning a grand ceremony for assuming his title. Ryko heard these stories at the market with indifference, more concerned with hiding his own nature. But Adela was intrigued, though she seemed shy about asking. One day, returning from a hunt, Ryko encountered Gerlinda, a werewolf from his former pack, on the trail. Her fur was silvery, and her eyes burned with purpose. She hinted that the pack needed a new leader because chaos was breaking out in various lands. Humans were growing more dangerous, and werewolves were scattered. She was convinced that Ryko must come back and unite his own. He refused, recalling old feuds and bloodshed. Gerlinda glared at him with contempt, nodding toward the cave. "You've grown attached to humans. That's a weakness." Ryko frowned and curtly replied he had no wish to plunge into conflict again. Returning to the cave, he found Adela at the mirror, nervously fixing her hair and jumping at his entrance. On the stone shelf lay the sweets Ryko had brought, but she ignored them. When questioned, she was silent, staring at the floor. Tension clouded her gaze, though it was unclear why. Meanwhile, word spread through the city that Duke Albrecht was organizing a grand hunt for a huge beast. Someone had discovered tracks on the outskirts, transitioning from wolf prints to human footprints. The townspeople were alarmed, believing it to be the work of a dangerous werewolf. Some of the rumors reached Adela. She discreetly gathered details. The Duke was young, ambitious, and relished flashy outings. One day at the market, after Ryko finally coaxed her into going, Adela saw Albrecht with her own eyes. He rode in with a cheerful retinue, stopping to joke with the local girls on the street, offering to give a bouquet for a kiss. Suddenly, Adela shouted that she would bring him the head of a werewolf, if that meant he would take her as his wife. His companions burst into laughter, and the Duke smirked, giving a joking nod. Adela blushed, her heart pounding. A passionate admiration flared inside her for this handsome young ruler. On the way home, she was silent. Ryko sensed that her thoughts were far from his reach. He noticed the strange gleam in her eyes, the tight line of her lips. Once back at the cave, Adela barely spoke, sitting near the stone hearth as though she did not recognize herself. Ryko tried to ask what troubled her, but she avoided his questions. In her chest, longing burned stronger than reason. Could she really sacrifice everything for the faint hope of marrying the Duke? That night was starless, and a dense fog blanketed the base of Eisenklippe. Ryko, worn out from a lengthy hunt, was making his way back to the cave. He sensed something off in the air a few hundred yards from the entrance. A trickle of unease ran through him, but he paid little mind. He only wanted to reach the fire and rest. He never expected the whistle of a blade in the darkness. A sudden burst of pain lanced his chest. On reflex, Ryko hurled the attacker aside. A dull thud, a woman's cry, and then silence. Pressing a hand to his chest, the werewolf probed his wound. It ran deep, but the blade was neither silver nor smeared with aconite. He would survive, though pain gripped his every movement. After a moment, his eyes adjusted to the dark. He made out a figure on the ground, motionless. Rushing closer, he felt his heart drop. It was Adela. Her hand still clutched his own hunting knife. Her eyes were open, but the light was fading from them. Her throat had been torn in that single moment when Ryko flung his assailant away. Apparently, he had bared his wolf fangs at the last instant, not realizing whom he was striking. He knelt, lifting her body. It felt as though his mind might tear apart. Why had she done this? Her tattered clothes were stained with blood and dirt. Perhaps she had planned to catch him unaware, deal a fatal blow from behind, all to earn the Duke's favor. Ryko remembered their recent conversation in which Adela had shyly kept her thoughts to herself. It seemed desperation had pushed her to fulfill her own promise. If she killed a werewolf, she might gain a luxurious life. Staring at the lifeless face of the girl he had once saved, Ryko felt an immense emptiness and overwhelming fury surge inside him. He gently carried her body into the cave and covered it with old furs. His hands trembled. Everything around him lost meaning. He found Adela's diary hidden beneath her worn blanket. Opening it, he read entries describing Duke Albrecht, the things he had said at the market, and her wild plan to earn his attention. The pages were decorated with little hearts and shaky lines describing her dream to escape a life of poverty. Reading these words, Ryko flung the diary aside in rage. The pain in his chest intensified. A haze of tears blurred his vision. In the cave's darkness, he let out a muffled moan, clutching his hair with his fingers. Everything in him rebelled against what humanity had done. They had taken the dearest thing he had, and didn't even realize it. The girl had chosen her path, but its roots lay in human greed and the cruelty that permeated the world. Slowly, Ryko stood. The wound's pain no longer mattered. A strange burning spread through his heart. He felt himself changing, not into his usual wolf form, but into something far more terrifying. His body grew larger, bones nearly ripping through his skin. He became a monstrous creature, capable of crushing stone walls. The pads of his paws hardened, and a tearing power pulsed through his spine. He roared so loudly that boulders shifted at the bottom of the gorge. The fog pulled back, and the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating his dreadful silhouette. His eyes glowed red, as though reflecting flames. Without hesitation, Ryko charged downward, heading for Kurtwalden. He traveled fast, almost without pausing, covering a quarter-mile in moments. Rage and a thirst for vengeance churned inside him. He blamed the Duke for his reckless bargain. He hated all humankind for finding such jokes amusing, oblivious to their consequences. Upon reaching the city's outskirts, the stone walls seemed tiny. With one mighty strike, he dislodged a boulder that crashed into a line of guards. Screams sounded through the dark streets. People flooded out of their homes in panic, trying to understand what monster was attacking. Torches flared. Horns sounded the alarm. Soon, Ryko reached the castle gates, towering nearly 30 feet. They gave way after only a few blows of his massive paws. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Servants fled, courtiers shrieked in terror. The werewolf smashed furniture, splintering supports and columns. His roar echoed, breaking the guards' resolve. No one dared engage him at close range. Thunderous crashes tore through the interior gates of the castle. At last, Ryko burst into the chambers, drawn by frantic footsteps. In a lavishly furnished room, Albrecht was cowering. The young man staggered backward, trembling with fear. He couldn't even lift his sword. The beast drew closer, unleashing its long claws. In another instant, the Duke might have been torn apart. But Ryko, panting heavily, just stared at him. He saw that this man was connected to what had happened to Adela. The beast's eyes blazed, unable to focus on the chamber's details. The expensive fabrics, the velvet drapes, the table laden with goblets. None of it mattered. The young man tried to grab his weapon, but the blade slipped from his shaking hands. With a few swift steps, Ryko closed the distance, seized Albrecht by the collar, and lifted him off the floor. In the monster's grip, the Duke was like a rag doll. The guards had no time to intervene. They clustered at the entrance, paralyzed by terror. A low growl rumbled from Ryko's chest as he watched the color drain from the Duke's face. The air reeked of fear and sweat. The stone walls quaked with noise, and the bony protrusions on Ryko's back glimmered in the flicker of scattered torches. The city groaned beneath collapsed beams, but the worst of all was unfolding here in the Duke's private quarters. The fate of a young ruler, whose fatal joke had become Adela's last hope, was being decided. The shattered doors of the castle chambers creaked, showering splinters across the floor. The beast, still in its monstrous form, held Albrecht by his collar. The Duke tried to strike with his fist, but his shaking arms proved useless. Torches flickered in their sconces, illuminating bloody claw marks on the stone tiles. A stale smell of fear and smoke filled the room. Ryko tightened his grip on the young man's throat, but suddenly something made him loosen it. On Albrecht's collarbone was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Ryko remembered that Adela had borne a mark in almost the same spot, as though piercing the roar and chaos in the beast's mind. The image of that little girl sitting by the fire in the cave flashed before him. He heard her voice. "Brother Ryko." The monster hissed, breathing through clenched fangs. Gasping for air, Albrecht managed a few words. His eyes shone with horror, but also a flicker of understanding. It seemed he realized the sister who had vanished years ago might have survived. He hastily confessed, "Father, ordered it all, hidden, to avoid disgrace." Still gripping him, Ryko felt his fury begin to wane. His mind was shifting. He started reverting to a more human-like shape, though monstrous features still remained. His giant paws began to shrink, bones cracking. In a low, rasping voice, Ryko said, "She died because of your joke. You promised to take her as your wife if she brought you the head of a werewolf. She believed this was her one real chance." Albrecht shook his head, choking out, "It was a joke." He fell silent, unable to find any defense. The beast released his collar, letting the young man drop to his knees. The Duke sucked in air, trembling from the near brush with death. Ryko clenched the bony growths on his forearms. Blood still dripped from his claws. He exhaled with difficulty, biting down on his lip. Outside there were still screams, but here in the chamber a dreadful hush had fallen. The Duke looked up at the werewolf, who regarded him intently, as if deciding whether to kill him then and there. Little by little the beast withdrew, leaving Albrecht alive. "You will find her body," Ryko said in a harsh tone, "on the eastern slope of Eisenklippe, where she attacked me herself." Consider it her gift for sparing your life." Clutching his neck, Albrecht said nothing. His expression betrayed remorse and a sense of guilt. Yet he had no words. Ryko turned toward the gaping hole through which he had broken in and headed out. A few guards tried to block his way, but he brushed them aside. Although his beastly form was losing some of its terrifying traits, he still had enough strength to knock aside an entire group of soldiers. Chaos ruled in the castle's courtyard. Chunks of collapsed walls and rubble cluttered the walkways. Fires blazed here and there. People raced about, hauling the wounded and battling the flames. Spotting the departing beast, they shrank back in horror. No one dared attack him, afraid of sharing the fate of those lying beneath the debris. Ryko breathed hard, shards of stone crunching beneath his feet. Panic hung thick in the air, though most sounds were drowned out by the crackling of fire. With effort, the werewolf climbed over heaps of rubble and left the courtyard, disappearing through the breach in the city gate. Few noticed him leave, since alarm horns reverberated everywhere. A few soldiers cried out when they saw the massive figure escaping beyond the fortress walls, but no fight ensued. The beast sought no further carnage. He was heading away, Adela's voice still ringing in his ears. Before long, he reached the city's outskirts. Torchlight faded behind him, and only the ruddy glow above the rooftops showed that Kirchwalden had survived a dreadful attack. Ryko felt he could no longer remain in that frenzied state. The transformation was draining him, and he needed to get away to fully return to human form. Picking his way over piles of stone and felled trees, he saw that the city was not completely destroyed, though the damage was immense. Meanwhile, Albrecht struggled to his feet, swaying. Guards rushed to him, trying to assist and demanding to know what had happened. He could barely respond, rasping only that he was alive. Even as he spoke, he named the beast and hinted it was somehow tied to his missing sister. No one knew what to say. The Duke gripped one of the soldiers by the shoulder and forced out, "Go to the eastern slope. Find the girl." His words echoed into a stunned silence. No one understood the full meaning. No one grasped why the beast had spared Albrecht's life. The destruction was colossal, with fires raging in some quarters. Yet the Duke himself remained unharmed. When servants and healers attempted to bind his wounds with herbal infusions, he stared vacantly at the battered doors, recalling the creature's grip that had nearly ended his life. A crushing guilt grew inside him. How much harm had his joke caused? The face of the sister he never got to help seemed fated to haunt him. When dawn arrived, Kirchwalden presented a horrifying sight. Many streets lay buried under the rubble of crumbled stone towers, house roofs were caved in, and pockets of fire still smoldered from the night before. People ran about, searching for their relatives, pulling out the injured, mourning the dead. Guards did what they could to keep the panic in check, organizing efforts to clear debris. Some residents claimed they had seen the beast smashing rocks with its paws, causing parts of the city walls to collapse. Others insisted it was the wrath of the sorcerer's curse, an ancient legend passed down for years. By then, Ryko had already left the central districts. Only the rubble in his wake remained. He hadn't planned to finish off the city or slaughter everyone. His initial fury had ebbed, replaced by a sense of emptiness. The fog still drifted around him, thinning in the morning light, and for a moment he resembled a pale shadow on the horizon before vanishing toward the forest roads. Albrecht awakened in his quarters, though the smoke and destruction made it nearly impossible to stay there. Servants had bandaged his wounds with healing tinctures. The pain was intense, but his guilt was even worse. He recalled the beast's words. Find her body at the eastern slope of Eisenklippe. After a few urgent orders, a band of knights rode out in search. By midday, they located a young woman's corpse lying by the cliff. Her throat was torn, her clothes ripped. Word spread, in hushed tones, that the same birthmark the Duke bore was visible on her collarbone. The news of the dead woman was kept quiet by official decree, and a modest burial was arranged. The higher-ups wanted no new rumors to further undermine Albrecht's position. Still, whispers circulated among the populace that the Duke might not be the only surviving member of the Steinbrück family, and that the beast had mentioned a sister. No one could confirm the rumors, though. The city was steeped in fear and anger. Church bells tolled constantly, urging people to repent of their sins to avert utter destruction. Some genuinely believed that without prayer, Kirchwalden would have been wiped off the map. Meanwhile, in the woods, people began discovering bodies mangled by telltale fang marks. Evidently, the werewolves had not all withdrawn. Gerlinda or others from the pack might have seized the general panic to exact vengeance on humans. Townsfolk knew not whom to blame. Some pointed at the Duke for his reckless words, others at the werewolf himself for inflicting such devastation. But all agreed on one point. Fear of a new attack overshadowed even the bravest hearts. After extensive talks with his advisors, Albrecht made a decision to summon the army and launch an all-out hunt for werewolves in the surrounding forests. He wanted vengeance for the city's destruction and needed to reaffirm his authority. The people supported this plan, hoping it would rid them of the beastly threat. Beneath the castle walls, fresh pikes were forged, and peasants helped gather provisions for the troops. The Duke, however, kept his greatest secret to himself. He knew the dead young woman was indeed his sister. The realization tormented him, for he understood that her desperate attempt to kill the beast was tied to his careless words. Each evening, Albrecht slipped into the castle chapel, struggling with the weight of his guilt. He prayed before the image of the Steinbrück family's patron saint, yet found no solace. The chapel's walls felt cold, and candle-lit candelabras cast wavering shadows. Though shaken, the city slowly began to stir back to life. Some houses were under repair. Merchants reopened their shops, hoping for even a small profit. People boarded up cracks in the walls and tried to seal broken wells. Streets were heavily patrolled by infantrymen who remained on edge, unsure whether the beast would return. Nearby villages panicked as well after messengers delivered news of the attack. Some fled to distant relatives, unwilling to live near a forest haunted by a monster. For several nights, dread hung in the air. The moon lay hidden behind clouds, and no one dared wander beyond the barricades. Nobody knew what to think of Ryko, who had vanished right after the assault. Some believed he still lurked in city cellars. Others thought he had retreated to the mountains. Everywhere, the sense of coming change was tangible. The scars of the recent onslaught would not heal quickly, and people nervously awaited the next storm. Ryko trudged along the mountain paths, where meltwater pooled on rocky ledges. The rough outcrops tore at his palms. Broken branches protruded at every turn, while soaked boulders bore the marks of his past encampments, now lifeless. He knew that after Adela's death, he could never return to the cave where they once shared food, laughed at simple things, and decorated the stone walls with her childish drawings. Some of her belongings were still there, but he couldn't bear to lay eyes on them. It seemed every corner of that cave was steeped in memories of the one who had called him brother. He traveled about 1.5 miles over steep slopes, trying not to dwell on the past. But even the jolting pain in his bones couldn't silence the emptiness inside him. Visions of little Adela adorned his mind. How she once tried to decorate his old jug with wildflowers. How she delighted in the single beam of bright morning light piercing into the cave. Those memories tore at his heart, and he felt that no cold wind or jagged rock could cause him more pain. Suddenly he heard rustling in the nearby thicket. Emerging from the low brush was the she-wolf Gerlinda, the same packmate from long ago. Resolve was etched into her face, and her fur gleamed silver in the early dawn light. She let out a terse growl, but didn't attack. Her human voice sounded low as she said, "I saw what you did to the city. People are whispering with fear. Now is the perfect time to finish them off before they recover." Raiko looked up and replied that he had no wish to continue the bloodshed. Gerlinda's ears twitched. She repeated that the pack would accept him as leader, for his strength had become legendary. But Raiko refused to live for pointless slaughter. Gerlinda listened, her eyes flashing with frustration as she labeled him weak for letting humans oppress werewolves. It was clear she had genuinely hoped he would lead the pack. Raiko simply shook his head, showing no interest in war or old grudges. Snarling, Gerlinda hurled accusations at him, pointing out he had always been too soft compared to his kin. Then, with one final growl, she vanished into the night's shadows. Left alone, Raiko felt his power dissipate along with his former rage. He no longer needed a pack or human recognition. He wandered aimlessly. When the sun's rays began dispersing the fog, he strayed from the main mountain trail, pushing through dense undergrowth. Tree trunks scraped his skin, leaving red welts. It felt like an eternity since he'd been so drained. Each time he stopped to catch his breath, fragments of Adela's voice crept into his thoughts. He remembered how she had babbled happily when she first picked up paint to illustrate blooming fields on the cave wall. After hours of aimless roaming, he reached a remote clearing about 2 miles from the old forest path. There he fashioned a crude shelter from branches and a coarse piece of cloth. A passing thought told him to flee farther still, over the high mountain passes into other lands. But deep down, a voice whispered he couldn't truly leave until he said a final goodbye to the past. Sitting by that frail makeshift shelter, Raiko turned a piece of bread over in his hands, left over from his last trip to Kirchwalden. He hardly tasted it. The chilly air stung his lungs, and he felt as though his human shape was pointless. The wolf's skin was closer to his true self, yet even in beast form he found no peace. He did not want death, yet the sorrow in his soul nearly eclipsed any desire to live. He loathed the idea of more carnage, and he saw no future among humans or with his old kin. Several times, he considered returning to the cave to burn Adela's belongings, but whenever he recalled that place, his chest tightened. He could almost see her small figure bustling around the fire, trying to roast bits of meat. yet now only cold stone remained. Realizing he had never properly laid the past to rest, he decided on a farewell rite. At dawn the next day, he made his way to the eastern slope of Eisenklippe. That was where he had last seen Adela alive, the place where her fatal blow had backfired on her. Even though the Duke's men had already taken her body, Raiko wanted to do something to put an end to this painful cycle. It was as if he hoped some final ritual would allow him to move on without looking back. Night fell as he heard distant horn calls and saw the dancing glow of torches. Kirchwalden's forces were combing the forests on Albrecht's orders. Clearly, the Duke intended to rid the area of any potential threat. Raiko had no wish for another confrontation. He did not want to rip into human flesh again or defend himself before those who thrived on fear. Swallowing his bitterness, he slipped through the thick underbrush, avoiding the hunter's sight. Skirting their route, he noticed that people had set traps and strung nets along certain paths. The sight made his fists clench. There would be no mercy for any werewolf. He was forced to detour several hundred yards, moving silently so as not to alert those trailing him. Once past the danger zone, he stopped at the foot of a slope and looked upward, trying to recognize familiar landmarks. The fog was slowly clearing, revealing the distinct outline of the cliff where he had last lost the one he considered his sister. He knew the climb ahead would be difficult, but an inner sense of duty propelled him onward. As he approached that fateful spot, Raiko no longer cared about the minor wounds and scratches. He felt he needed to close the door on an old story. His heart pounded as he climbed a few dozen feet. Around half a mile up, he could see the narrow ridge he was aiming for. It seemed each step carried a special weight. Suddenly, he caught the smell of smoke and realized that humans might be scaling these heights as well. He did not plan on a direct clash. If he had to fight, he was ready, but he would rather avoid shedding new blood. At last, he reached a ledge where he decided to wait out the hours before dawn. He needed time to gather his thoughts and prepare for a final farewell. Human voices echoed from somewhere below, but no one had climbed so high yet. Raiko peered into the distance where the lights of Kirchwalden flickered behind a low-lying veil of mist. Once he had gazed at those same lights, dreaming of hunts and a life that seemed to hold meaning. Now, everything was different. Before closing his eyes for a brief rest, he noticed the horn calls had drifted west. The guards were likely hunting other werewolves. Raiko realized he had only a small window to finish his goodbye. He pressed himself to the ground, listening to the shouts fade, and sensed that meeting humans again might be inevitable. But today, he resolved to stay hidden until he accomplished his purpose. When the first streak of dawn touched the sky, he laid a hand on the rock face, as though trying to feel the pulse of this land before leaving it. Early in the morning, Raiko continued onward, determined to find the very spot at the base of Eisenklippe's eastern slope, where he had once left Adela's lifeless body. He traveled slowly, barely pausing, staying out of the hunter's line of sight. A cool silence enveloped the area, broken only by the faint echo of city horns sometimes cutting through the mountain mass. By midday, he reached a rocky patch strewn with the wreckage of a carriage and half-rotted bits of luggage. Here, the tragedy from 10 years past overlapped with a new one. Once this road proved fatal for a retinue, and later it sealed Adela's fate. Raiko stopped, scanning the area. Her body was gone, meaning people from Kirchwalden had already taken the remains. He moved a few more yards to the exposed roots of an old tree and surveyed his surroundings. There was no cross or any other marker that might commemorate her existence. He stood there for quite some time. An emptiness grew inside him. He longed to see at least a rough plaque or a stone, some sign that her life had not simply vanished without trace. But the place looked abandoned. Raiko sank to his knees, ran his hand across the damp ground, and clenched his fingers as if trying to carry a piece of this earth with him. Then he whispered a few quiet words, their recipient unclear, and shut his eyes. Meanwhile, back in Kirkwalden, Duke Albrecht found no peace. Each night, nightmares tormented him, visions of his sister standing at the precipice, condemning him for realizing her existence too late. Court rumors claimed he had sunk into melancholy, spending hours in his rooms and rarely conversing with his advisors. But in that state, he suddenly decided he must visit the slopes of Eisenklippe himself. Perhaps he hoped to ease his conscience, or at least confirm that his sister's body rested in the ground. With a handful of trusted companions, he left the city in secret, bringing horses but drawing no attention from the main guard. They reached the mountain base in about half a day, winding along narrow trails and detouring to avoid other patrols. Before long, the Duke's group spotted a lone figure sitting beneath a tree. An experienced guardsman recognized it as the man Werewolf, although few had seen Raiko in such a calm state. Albrecht gestured for them not to shoot, sensing that no immediate threat loomed. Drawing closer, he saw the weariness and concealed scorn in Raiko's eyes. He wanted to ask about his sister, but struggled for words. Raiko lifted his chin, making no move to attack. A heavy silence fell between them, charged with lingering hostility and the weight of untold truths. Finally, Albrecht broke the silence. I wanted to know the truth. About her. He trailed off, unable to continue. The only response was a quiet snarl from among the bushes. Gerlinda the she-wolf and several other werewolves appeared without warning. Their fur shimmered dully in the half-light, their gazes brimming with aggression. They recognized Albrecht and his men, as well as Raiko, who in their view no longer stood with his kin. Gerlinda pointed a paw at the Duke and growled that this human deserved death. She blamed Kirchwalden's rulers for stoking fear and mustering patrols to hunt down werewolves. The guards gripped their weapons, fully aware of the danger. Realizing a fight was unavoidable, Raiko positioned himself between the humans and the wolves. He let out a low snarl for them to stop the bloodshed, declaring enough lives had been lost. Gerlinda called him a traitor and lunged. A brief but fierce struggle erupted. Raiko assumed his beast form, though he did not push himself to the extreme as he had during the raid on the city. He sought to scare off his kin rather than kill them. Albrecht's guard shielded the Duke, who fought to steady his horse and to keep clear of the wolves' claws. Raiko did his best to disable his former packmates, shoving and knocking them over without going for lethal bites. Gerlinda, driven by a blind desire to kill the Duke, lunged among the guards' blades, biting one soldier's arm and trying to reach Albrecht. But the beast intercepted her, slamming her aside. She rolled away with a furious howl. After a few minutes, the other werewolves began to retreat. Wounded by silver swords, Gerlinda shouted a threat that she would return with greater numbers. She cast a look of contempt at Raiko, then vanished into the undergrowth, leaving behind those too hurt to keep fighting. Albrecht's guard stood panting, tending to their wounded. The Duke looked at Ryko, unsure how to speak. He knew that without the beast's intervention, many more would have died. Confusion surged inside him. With a small nod, he voiced his thanks for being saved. Ryko, back in human form, let his gaze slide over the Duke in silence, then stepped away. A few guards gripped their weapon hilts reflexively, but Albrecht ordered them to lower their swords. Ryko turned and walked into the forest, hearing the Duke murmur words of gratitude. Moments later, Albrecht's party was alone amidst smashed brush, paw prints, and bloodstains. The Duke realized that in Kirchwalden, countless questions would arise about where the beast's loyalties lay. No one could provide a clear answer. Tension gripped the great hall of Kirchwalden's castle. Albrecht sat at the head of a long oak table, surrounded by knights, his closest advisors, and a few military experts from neighboring lands. They were all discussing the recent skirmish in the forest, which had nearly cost the Duke his life. Some proposed sending a large force immediately to destroy every werewolf in the woods. Others believed that would only provoke the pack further. Albrecht understood he could not ignore the threat. Villagers 5 miles from the city reported attacks on livestock, leaving only gnawed bones behind. Panic spread, and people fled. Yet he could not forget how the beast, whom the entire city feared, had saved him from the wolf pack's claws. Perhaps not all werewolves were driven by pure cruelty. His advisors mentioned an old prophecy suggesting that if the wrong werewolf were destroyed, an even more fearsome retribution might follow. Some considered it mere superstition, but many knights recalled how Ryko had nearly leveled Kirchwalden with a few powerful strikes of his colossal paws. Doubting the curse's power was difficult. After long debate, the Duke rose and ordered silence. He spoke quietly, but each word rang with certainty. He admitted that doing nothing could doom the city, especially since Gerlinde seemed to be rallying scattered werewolf clans. Albrecht, however, did not want another wave of slaughter. His people were still reeling from the last devastation. Ordinary citizens expected their ruler to protect them, not wage endless war. A persistent guilt over his sister gnawed at him. He often pored over family records, noting that Adela had been born in the cold season, yet no further mention of her fate was made. He realized his father, the old Duke, had concealed the tragic truth, and that he himself had not been determined enough to learn more. Now this had led to death and destruction. Beyond the castle walls, life struggled on in fits and starts. Some residents clamored for the Duke to exterminate the werewolves at once, calling down righteous wrath on the curse besetting the city. Others, more pragmatic, argued that a frontal assault would only unite their enemies. The city's priests increased the frequency of services, urging citizens to repent and hoping this might soften the beast's anger. One morning, Albrecht received a report from a border outpost. A few peasants had spotted a large wolf pack in the east. One villager claimed the beasts moved with a disciplined formation, hinting Gerlinde was bringing the clans together. This news alarmed the Duke. The werewolves might lay siege to the city or launch a raid. Yet he also thought of Ryko, who had already acted to prevent needless slaughter. Albrecht tried sending envoys under a white flag to negotiate with possible pack representatives. The men returned saying they had met with nothing but hostility. Wolves attacked, and a voice in the forest shouted that the werewolves would tear the city apart once they were ready. Ryko's name was never mentioned, and the envoys concluded he had no part in the werewolves' current plans. Albrecht realized the werewolves were divided. Some wanted open war with humans, while others evidently roamed alone or refused to take sides. But if Gerlinde gathered enough allies, Kirchwalden would be in mortal danger. The castle walls were strong, yet everyone remembered how the powerful beast had broken through stone during his previous rampage. They might not even need another direct blow. Dozens of werewolves unleashed inside the city would wreak havoc. A few knights urged a preemptive strike. Dispatch 100 soldiers armed with silver weapons, hunting dogs, and enchanted torches to burn the forest. Albrecht listened, knowing such a plan could result in heavy casualties. Furthermore, in his heart he wanted to find Ryko and attempt to broker peace with the one who had already proven willing to stand against his own kind for the sake of ending the bloodshed. Ultimately, the Duke announced that he would personally lead a small band of knights into the forest to search for the beast. His advisors called it madness, but he insisted that if there was any chance to avoid bloodshed, he was honor-bound to try. It was not only fear of a curse driving him, but also the pain over his lost sister. Albrecht felt that if he could come to terms with Ryko, he might atone, at least in part, for his guilt. By the following evening, a group of 20 warriors and several trackers had gathered outside Kirchwalden's walls. They wore strong armor and carried crossbows loaded with silver-tipped bolts. Albrecht took steps to protect his own life, keeping close a sword forged from a special alloy, though he hoped he would not have to use it. The company ventured into the forest and set up a temporary camp about 1.5 miles from the city walls. At night, the knights lit fires, posted sentries, and tried to remain quiet, not wanting to provoke any lurking foes. A tense hush settled over the area. No one knew how many werewolves might be hiding among the trees. Albrecht sat wide awake by the fire, eyeing the forest's dark perimeter. He recalled speaking with Ryko by these same flames not so long ago, pleading for help. Now he clung to the hope of another meeting, uncertain whether the beast would offer any aid. If the werewolf had appeared once, perhaps he would appear again. Deep into the night, when the fires burned low, one of the sentries claimed he had seen a dark shape moving among the trees. Albrecht ordered no one to attack, instructing them only to observe. For a while, everyone remained on high alert. Then someone caught sight of glowing eyes in the undergrowth. Nobody fired. They merely stood ready. The silhouette withdrew, or at least faded from view. The Duke felt a nervous anticipation rising inside him. Would Ryko emerge in human form as before, or would this be Gerlinde's ambush? Toward dawn, as many grew drowsy, a figure emerged through the drifting smoke. It stood a little way off, but its outline suggested a human shape. Albrecht rose and signaled his knights not to shoot. The Duke's lips tightened, and his heart thumped. Perhaps this would be the most significant conversation of his life. Ryko approached the fire in human form. He looked worn out, and although he did not seem threatening, the knights gripped their weapons in caution. Albrecht made them lower their blades and stepped closer to the werewolf. The tension was palpable. Even the wind barely stirred the treetops, and the smoke from the fires hovered low, obscuring visibility past a few yards. Taking a steadying breath, the Duke spoke in a hushed voice. "I've been looking for you. I want peace. Help us avoid more bloodshed." Ryko gave him a guarded stare and asked why the Duke believed he would want to help. Albrecht hesitated, then mentioned his sister. "I finally understand. She was with you all those years, and I never even knew she was alive." Ryko spoke of how he found Adela among the dead in a wrecked carriage, of how he raised her, trying to grant her even a scrap of safety. He admitted he hadn't known of her noble birth, nor had it mattered to him. She was small and defenseless, and he was a wolf who would tear apart anyone who tried to harm her. But the fateful moment came when Adela believed the Duke's promise, despite it being made in jest. Albrecht listened with pained understanding, aware that his thoughtlessness had led to tragedy. He tried asking if there was any chance they could unite against Gerlinda now that her pack was growing. Ryko only shrugged, indifferent. He said he had no great desire to save humans, but neither would he allow werewolves to destroy everything around them. "I won't fight for your city," he said, "but I won't let the wolves start a merciless slaughter. Gerlinda is no friend of mine." Nearby knights held their silver swords at the ready. The beast might unleash his fury at any moment, but Albrecht ordered them not to attack. In the tense silence that followed, the Duke proposed an informal truce. "You don't touch us. We won't touch you. I don't believe we can be allies, but maybe neither of us wants more bloodshed." Ryko shook his head, as though unwilling to bind himself with promises. Then he warned that Gerlinda could rally several clans living in distant caves and forests. Some of them were rivals, but the threat posed by humans might unite them. According to Ryko, the city would be wise to shore up its walls and stock its provisions in anticipation of a possible siege. Albrecht thanked him for the advice, though he knew that mere defense would not solve everything. Before leaving, the Duke wanted to ask where Adela was laid to rest, but Ryko cut him off tersely. "Your people took her body. I hope she was buried better than she was left at that carriage." His voice carried a hidden bitterness. Albrecht nodded, admitting he had arranged a proper burial in the family crypt, though he kept it secret because of court intrigues. As they parted, Ryko flung a scalding remark at him. "You weren't worthy of her trust, but she loved you. Don't seek forgiveness from me, seek it in yourself." Albrecht had no answer. The beast turned toward the forest, tension in his stance suggesting he could revert to wolf form at any second. An instant later, Ryko was gone, fading as though into the drifting haze. When the Duke, instructing his men not to pursue, turned back to the knights, many were baffled at letting the beast go. Albrecht said he would not repeat the mistake that had cost his sister her life. Upon returning to Kirschwalden, he tried to reassure the townspeople that the beast was not their primary enemy. They remained fearful, recalling the destruction Ryko had wrought on the city. Discontent simmered, for some blamed the beast as the source of an ancient curse. Ryko climbed to the top of a secluded cliff, several miles from Kirschwalden. It rose about 300 feet above the nearby coniferous forest, offering a clear view of the city he once watched alongside Adela. The dawn light tinted the sky a pale gold, and thin plumes of smoke trailed from the city's chimneys. The werewolf stood there, remembering how 10 years before he had carried a trembling little girl into his cave. Back then, he didn't understand why he was protecting her, only that he felt compelled to save her. Now his heart felt hollow. He had taken his vengeance, launching an assault on the city and causing great destruction, yet he had neither destroyed everyone nor eased his own pain. It seemed that chapter was over, and he had nothing more to seek among these paths. Raiko glanced around, running his hand along the jagged surface of the stone. He knew he could never live in peace here. The townsfolk still feared him, and Gerlinda's pack despised him as a traitor. Leaving, so as not to be caught between two fires, seemed best. Deep down, he sensed that both humans and werewolves, exhausted by conflict, would ultimately find their own path, be it a new way of life or mutual destruction. Meanwhile, Kirchwalden was starting to recover. Farmers went back to their fields and pastures. The marketplace bustled once more with traders, and town criers filled the streets with their shouts. Workers repaired gaps in the walls, raising new fortifications at a frantic pace, all in readiness for a possible werewolf siege. Fresh legends about the beast's nocturnal visit circulated through the city. In hushed tones, people recounted how he tore through gates, smashed parts of the castle, and roared under the moonlight. At the market, women whispered to one another, "That silent hunter in the wolfskin hasn't been seen lately. Maybe he left, or maybe he was the cursed beast." Young girls quizzed the elders about whether the werewolf really wore a human guise and came to town for supplies. Albrecht, though physically healed, remained uneasy. He rarely spoke of his sister, and at court people merely noted his new reserve. He spent long evenings in the castle chapel, praying silently for the souls of all who had died. Rumor had it a nameless sarcophagus had appeared in the family crypt, and only those closest to him guessed whose remains it held. From time to time, the city guard conducted forest raids, looking for black wolf tracks, but found no clear sign of Raiko. Yes, werewolves were sighted here and there, and minor skirmishes took place, yet no one saw the beast who had once ravaged the city. Some claimed he had gone east, to distant lands. Gradually, people grew less afraid. Blacksmiths returned to forging horseshoes, housewives carried water from the wells, and the baker's family reopened their bread stall. Boys ran through the streets, taunting one another with tales of wolf eyes glowing in the night. At the fair, fruit and cloth vendors set up again, traveling minstrels played, and life moved on. Still, the memory of the attack never fully faded. Certain old women, glimpsing a moonlit sky, would cross themselves and whisper that the beast might return. But time passed, and the towering figure with bony spines did not reappear to ravage the streets. Little by little, the memory of that ruinous night became part of local folklore, where truth tangled with fearsome invention. Taking one last look toward Kirchwalden, Raiko understood he was saying farewell to these lands. His path led beyond the mountain ridge where his paws had never tread. Perhaps there he would find peace, or perhaps new trials awaited. Yet in that moment, he felt relief. He was free of the chains of the past. The city carried on. People built, traded, and cherished each day that passed without bloodshed, while only murky legends recalled the beast who had once known loss and wrath, and who in the end left them a chance,